Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
It's December 25th. Merry Christmas, everybody, and welcome to the holiday edition of US Modernist Radio. Oh, right, I have sleigh bells, too. George Smart and Frank King are here, as always, even on Christmas Day, to talk about people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Show your support by visiting US Modernist's massive mid-century modern archives at, where else, USModernist.org, or join our newsletter list at ncmodernist.org. Today's guests include landscape architect Lewis Clarke and architect Erin Sterling Lewis. And now, just back from ElfCon at the North Pole, George Smart.
Yes, I was just at the North Pole, attending a conference for former Santa elves. Merry Christmas. It's called ElfCon, and you might not know that I was once on Santa's payroll at the mall. But now, the famous David Sedaris sold his story before I could even put pen to paper, and he's cornered the ex-elf market. Anyway, I've got some great architecture news. After many tortured years putting up with Santa's hoarding, and make no mistake, he has a serious hoarding problem, Mrs. Claus has thrown all his personal junk onto the ice and hired a modernist architect to build a new minimalist concrete and steel residence for the Clauses. She's interviewed Richard Meyer's less famous brother Oscar, that guy Ted from How I Met Your Mother, and she was very disappointed to learn that Mike Brady passed away decades ago.
Oh.
But the architect she picked, and this is his real name, is Rem Koolhaas. Thanks to global warming, Ms. Claus will be putting in an Olympic, a swimming pool, and a barbecue pit because reindeer do wear out. Support for US Modernist Radio comes from Sarah Sonk of Mod Homes Realty. It's the most wonderful time of the year, that time when children's faces light up when they get their Lego architecture sets. Hipsters buy used Barcelona chairs off of eBay, and you turn to your spouse and say, "Damn it, Brittany, I'm so tired of this old house," or "Damn it, Brad, I'm so tired of this apartment. This is the year we're building a modernist house." That's why Realtor Sarah Sonk of Mod Homes Realty brings modernism right down your chimney. So be sure to leave her some cookies and milk. www.modhomesrealty.com or 919-601-7339. And if you're wondering where Frank is today, he is on vacation in Oxnard, Mississippi, looking for a Radio Shack. We'll be hearing from him hopefully later.
That's not being made up either.
In the early 60s, which according to President Trump was when America was really great, we were optimistic about architecture. Magazines about design, which now run maybe 70 pages a month, were running 300 to 400 pages of head-turning designs, one after the other. There was a post-war building boom that had not yet stopped, and cities were transforming themselves from a 1930s look into the classic mid-century vibe we know and love now. States looked at their aging Capitol buildings and considered sweeping new plans to bring technology, commerce, and government, even the performing arts, into the full 20th century. One of the few state capitals to actually achieve this was Albany, New York. The Empire State Plaza is a series of modernist office and cultural buildings that started in the late 1950s, and it's gorgeous. It's a little in need of maintenance, as most buildings of that age are, but it's a stunning achievement spearheaded by New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller and designed primarily by architect Wallace Harrison. Albany's plan was so successful, other states wanted to do the same thing, and one of those was North Carolina. In 1965, the State Capital Planning Commission issued a report and a design they had been working on across several administrations. The goal was, like Albany, to transform the epicenter of downtown Raleigh, the state capital, into a city of the future. The Blue Ribbon panel of architects, consultants, and government members presented a beautiful plan that was written up. The leadership behind this plan was originally Governor Terry Sanford. Among other accomplishments, Governor Sanford was among the first high-profile public servants to confront race and poverty for both the future of the state and the nation. One of the consultants in this report is our first guest, a young man with lots of potential, who just turned 90. Lewis Clarke is one of North Carolina's most celebrated and prolific landscape architects. Beginning as a Boy Scout in the UK, he achieved the rare honor of Wood Badge and worked his ticket into World War II service with the British Royal Engineers. He came to Harvard on a Fulbright scholarship and taught at the North Carolina State University School of Design from 1952 to 1968, influencing generations of architects. And his 1,300 projects, papers, photographs, and slides are now at the NC State University Special Collections Research Center, their third largest collection. He's also received awards from Lady Bird Johnson, Betty Ford, and Nancy Reagan. Welcome, Lewis.
Thank you.
Erin Sterling Lewis is a partner at In Situ Studio in Raleigh. Her firm has won multiple design awards, including our own Matsumoto Prize, and she teaches at NC State University as well. She is president of AIA North Carolina, which represents thousands of architects in the state. She also works with NC Modernist on our high school outreach program, Project Bauhaus, for which we are most grateful. She has served on countless AIA committees. As she'll tell you, this is no easy job, plus the Raleigh Historic Development Commission and the Raleigh Planning Commission. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you.
So, Erin, I understand from our research department, which really digs into this, that you started your interest in architecture in the 3rd grade, designing floor plans for your friends. You described yourself as obsessed with floor plans. What kinds of houses did your friends ask for?
Oh, boy. I in addition to really loving architecture and for whatever reason loving floor plans, I also had a mind for business. And so my recesses were not spent playing with other kids. It was come around behind these bushes into my office and tell me about your dream house.
Wow.
So I took note of programs and listened to what they said, and I would go home and play with my graph paper, pencils, and rulers and create what has turned out to be, now that I look back on some of the archival documents that I have, pretty awful floor plans, but they, they represented a dream and a hope, and they were really fun to do for sure, to kind of put some form to the lives that my friends said they wanted to live.
And how old were you when you had these really awful floor plans?
They started to become a little more sophisticated in the 3rd to 5th grade realm. So what is that, 9 to 11 or 12,
Sure.
something like that?
What was your fee schedule, Erin? Did they pay you in Pop Rocks?
No, that's where I was a terrible businesswoman in my youth. I've gotten a little bit better about it over time for necessity, but no payment. It was all a favor because I loved it so much.
Lewis, I've got to ask, what is a Wood Badge? Is that the same as Eagle Scout? Because personally, having been thrown out of Weblo's due to a soft drink scandal, I'm curious.
A Wood Badge is a kind of development from Baden-Powell, who started the Boy Scouts. And you take lessons and then answer questions on paper. And then you go to a camp, a Gilwell camp, and they're all scoutmasters. And they act as a patrol in the camp. And eventually you get a Wood Badge. And it is a special neckerchief with a lanyard that goes through it, and is basically a high honor in the British Boy Scouting.
But it's similar to Eagle Scout here?
No, Eagle Scout is for the boys.
Okay.
Wood Badge is for the Scoutmasters.
Oh, for the Scoutmasters.
It's really a training session for Scoutmasters.
Okay.
Oh.
So, Lewis, you have been deep into modernist design, both professionally and personally. You designed your own house, and I understand that you were in an investment club with George Matsumoto, Milton Small, and Milton's clients, the Rothstein brothers, with Paul Stahl. Is that right?
How on earth did you find that out?
We have a crack research team here, Lewis.
They must be brilliant, because that was in 56, 58.
56, yeah.
A long time ago. The investment club was mostly composed of Jewish people.
Okay.
The Rothsteins and so on in town. The Rothsteins had the radio shop on Hillsborough Street, and I've no idea why I was invited to join them. But when I got in there was George Matsumoto and Milton Small, and then Ezra Meyer.
The engineer, yes.
Engineer, so I was engineer. So we had a wonderful time. Never made any money, of course.
Of course. So what kind of things did you guys talk about when you weren't talking investments?
I think architecture was a strong point in conversation because Matsumoto and Milton had designed houses for these members of the club.
The Rothsteins, who were all Jewish, I understand couldn't live in places like Five Points. They were prohibited by the covenants, so they bought land outside the city limits. Is that right?
Yes, it was really a horror story. I mean, in the 50s, which preceded all the racial problems that we had with the schools and the children. For instance, you would not find a Jewish person in the Carolina Country Club.
Okay.
There was a country club on Newbern Avenue. I forget the name of it.
The Raleigh Country Club.
Raleigh Country Club.
Yes.
That was really all the Jewish people joined. Of course, I didn't belong to either one of them.
Okay. When you first came to North Carolina in 1952, was there any formal landscape architecture? What was the scene like then?
Landscape architecture in North Carolina probably started right at the end of the 19th century.
Okay.
Few people realize this. And it was in horticulture and all a part of agriculture, and eventually was transferred when architecture came out of the School of Engineering in 1948. Landscape architecture came out of horticulture.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm. Pillsbury was the head, and Gil Thurlow.
Gil Thurlow, of course.
Graduated from the horticultural school under Pillsbury. And it was at that time that most of the connections with Harvard occurred in the very early 20th century, long before Kempf and the school design.
Right.
And very few people realized there was a long heritage for that.
So how did the movement to redesign the capital area get started, Lewis?
I think it was Governor Sanford who originated the idea, as he did many things for the state at that time. And he was brilliant in appointing a committee of 8 people: Mrs. Abernathy, Robert Lee Humber, Jack Parker. Jack Parker was head of the planning school in Chapel Hill. Brian Shawcroft, curiously enough, was on the commission. George Stevens, of course, was on the commission. Pearson Stewart, who was one of the original people working with Governor Hodges and Watts Hill on the Research Triangle, and Mrs. Earl Teague, an absolutely superb commission or client. And they had as advisor to them Bob Anderson, who was a member of the firm of Architectural Planning Associates. And curiously enough, George, Jim Webb was in that.
Jim Webb, sure.
In that office. He assembled a magnificent team of people. Carl Feiss out of Washington.
Okay.
Harwell Harris. Let's see, Bob Browning, who was the engineer, and Bob Browning spent many hours with us. Bill Horn from Kimley Horn.
Okay, great.
And I knew everybody he appointed. In fact, Bob Horn and I kept a powerboat side by side in Little Washington at the time. This group of people, the commission as a client and the team who were going to do the work, was absolutely superb. It was almost an enchanted group, a group that you could very rarely put together. And how Governor Sanford managed to catalytically put together such a fantastic group, I don't know. The only member on that we as workers on it were worried about was Robert Lee Humber.
And he was with the Museum of Art, right?
Right. And he had been charged with forming the art collection, the state art collection for the state. And, of course, his patronage was the Haynes textile resources. Well, we were worried because he was collecting classical paintings and was totally against contemporary paintings or modern paintings.
Ah, okay.
And so Kemp, Hefner and Crowd used to argue like mad with him. Well, anyway, that's the team that was put together. An absolutely magnificent effort by Governor Sanford.
So the team worked on this report, I understand, a couple of years.
From 63 and presented it in 65.
65. And did the newspapers rave with the reviews? Did the crowd roar with applause? Did the politicians jump up and down, say how excited they were about all this, Lewis?
Well, actually, it's a Cinderella story. I mean, not a Christmas story. I can't find a simile, for Christmas, but I can find one for Cinderella.
Okay.
So it was a magnificent beginning, a superb pumpkin, and a dreadful demise.
So it's sort of Cinderella in reverse?
Yeah, she went back to the ashes.
Okay.
And so what happened in this, and maybe I should tell you about the demise later on in the program rather than kill it right now.
Okay. Well, we'll wait for the death of this project a little bit later. Let's switch over here to Erin. Erin, most people are not familiar with the AIA. They've heard the letters, and they know that if you open up the jar of AIA, there are a bunch of architects in there. But what does the AIA do in general in North Carolina?
So we operate as an association on 3 levels. So there's the national representation, who's largely responsible for architecture and any sort of policy or bill-related items on a federal level. And the state is not too different from that in that they have the real conduit to our legislature. But they also kind of manage the scenario that we have here in North Carolina, which are 7 separate local sections spread evenly throughout the state. At least geographically, member-wise, it's not that way. You might imagine our biggest chapters or sections are in Charlotte and Raleigh. So AIA stands for the American Institute of Architects. And when I joined as a young pup,
this was in 6th grade or 7th?
I'm pretty driven, but not that driven. Maybe if I knew what AIA was at the time, they weren't doing their jobs enough to let me know as a kid what AIA was, or I may have changed that. Probably, 5 or 6 years into practicing architecture here in Raleigh, I started to learn about AIA and become involved. And I'm also a little bit of an impatient person, and so I'm very anxious, and I like to see the positives and make things happen, actionable person. And I used to sit in these meetings and listen to architects talk to each other about how architects the general public doesn't value architects. And I realized you guys just keep talking to yourselves. What are you doing? It's not so hard to turn around and get out there. So for the last 4 years or so, AIA North Carolina and the local sections have had a pretty strong effort in a public outreach initiative that we call Activate, which is basically to turn that conversation around and get out there and show people what we care about as architects, but also invite the general public in to be part of a conversation about how architecture and design can better impact everybody's community, which is so wonderful to have just read through the entire planning document for something that I think is exactly a deliverable that we should be producing these days as architects still. It's been a while, but it's going to happen again.
Well, Erin, at the time of the 1965 report, the architecture community, I understand, was super behind this. They really wanted to have this happen. And I'm looking at a picture of one of the plans, and I want to describe it to our listeners. So if you can imagine a state capitol building, which ours is great, but it's like many other state capitals across the country, particularly in the South. And all around it are water features with bridges and little islands that connect to various kinds of buildings, some office, some cultural, parking has been moved out of it entirely. I assume that some of that was put underground at some point. And then all along the roadways, there are these collections of trees on either side that border the streets and guide you into this. If you want to see what I'm talking about, you can go to ncmodernist.org and type in 1965 State Capitol Master Plan into the search box, and you can get a copy of this very report. You can print it out, or you can put it on your iPad, and you can see what we're talking about. You want to you skip through some of it. It's a long report, but get to the photos. That's where it really shines through, and you can see what this really could have been like at the time. So, Lewis, now time for the demise part. What happened with this plan?
Well, it started off so well with the personnel chosen to do it. We came up with a unique plan, and the features that you mentioned, the lakes and so on. In 1850, there were 15 state employees. In 1926, there were 700. And in 1963, 5,600.
5,600.
And this plan, the completion date for it was 2000. There were almost 17,000 employees.
Wow.
So that was the projection.
The projection.
Right. So imagine being presented with this. You're going to design a new legislative area for the town. And if you say 80 cars per acre,
okay,
which is very high, that's straight blacktop.
Okay.
So if you cut it back to about 60, you're talking of some 125 acres of parking.
Wow.
Around the Capitol. So everybody on the team was ready to resign. You couldn't say site inappropriate. And we started off with 758 acres and finished up with 157. And that's how the lakes got onto the scheme. So we said, we'll have to design this in such a way that we design the parking and the circulation. And then we put all the soil back and plant the top. So by using high-rise buildings, and we'd use one high-rise with a lobby, and then you could attach 4 to it ultimately as a cruciform.
Yes.
So that reserved space of the 157 acres. So we finished up. We wanted to create something unique, something that was not just parking and blacktop and buildings again.
So was the parking under the lakes or underground?
Not under the lake.
Okay. Where'd you put it?
Well, the first thing we said was no cross streets in this area. The area went from Person Street on the east to Peace Street on the north to McDowell on the left, which is really the Seaboard Railroad tracks,
right,
and Caswell Center. The only 2 cross streets were McDowell and Morgan, which are the 2 streets north and south of the Capitol. And then they had proposed this terrible superhighway going down between East and...
that was going to go through Oakwood.
Right.
And that was the beginning of the Oakwood Revolution to stop that highway from coming through. So
we said everybody coming to town is a destination. So there's no reason that they should pass through this government center. So if you came down Hillsborough Street, instead of continuing around the Capitol, you went underground. If you came Newbern Avenue, you went underground. So all the parking, except for 1,200 spaces, were underground, underneath the buildings. These clusters of buildings were connected by a road. For instance, Bob Anderson's group collected all the statistics, and they came up with, projected for 2,000 visits between agencies.
Oh, okay.
I mean, there are no computers and a very primitive telephone, so everybody went physically. So there was a whole world underneath the buildings, which threw off something like 15 or 20 acres that we could make into a real park. And there's 10 acres of lakes, and the land slopes gently into Smoky Hollow. So we have 4 very shallow dams and 5 lakes, which is super because then that takes all the rainwater from the buildings It can be used for circulation for air conditioning, and it's pumped from the lower level up to the top, so it circulates all the time.
So what were some of the features of the whole complex? For instance, did it have any residential component or any retail or restaurants or performing arts kinds of functions?
That gets a little more in detail than the concept of the master plan.
Okay.
But 40%, which is about 64 acres, was state-owned of the land.
All right.
19% is what you're talking about, is privately owned land that would remain in the midst of the plan. Churches and similar features, architectural features that we felt should stay. And then food services and all the other services were supplied in each cluster. So the theory was you come to work, you immediately go underground and park. And then you go under the underground system or immediately straight up into a cluster of buildings, and you spend the day in a park. So you come out at lunchtime and you can sit around the park. In the cost analysis, we had $14 million for land acquisition.
Okay.
Which is a wonderful figure to me, $12 million for landscape.
That's a good budget for 1965.
So it would have been an absolutely unique state capital. Why we didn't do it? It would have been marvelous at those figures, because it was a toss-up in the beginning where they do basically low-rise buildings, which had been built to date, which ran around $16 to $17 a square foot. Or we could go 15 stories, and it was $18 to $19 a foot. So we immediately jumped to every building was basically 15, except, of course, for the Art Museum, the Museum of Natural History, Archives, and the State Library, which were all in Heritage Square.
So as this plan was announced, what happened? Did they just reject it outright? What was the reception to it from the legislature and the people who had to make that kind of decision?
Well, I think generally it was accepted as being magnificent, a really great plan, as I think it is today, and many wish it had been built. So the chairman of the commission presented this booklet to the governor, who was then Governor Moore.
Dan Moore.
So he promptly decommissioned the commission, decommissioned the Heritage Commission, and appointed the governor and the Council of State as the
Okay. And that was like the end?
That was the end. Yeah. Then, of course, Goody Odell got the job.
Okay.
And you can see what Goody did. It's there now.
So Goody Odell designed the Archdale building, which if you come through Raleigh, is a giant white obelisk that kind of stands out by itself in town. You can't miss it. It's off all by itself. The story goes is that this building, which was originally quite striking and architecturally significant, was value engineered by the governor and the Council of State until it just sort of became this tombstone marker. And Odell eventually distanced himself from it.
They do light it up with Christmas lights every year.
They do? I did not know that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, doesn't look like much more than a box with lights on the edge. But
so, Erin, you live and work adjacent to this neighborhood where this complex would have been. Tell our audience, what actually happened, what got put up down there and what didn't.
You mean since the plan?
Yeah.
So the legislative building was already there, right? You guys were kind of reacting to that in your design.
That had been there 2 years.
2 years, yeah, and very beautiful. And maybe, how was it received? I'm curious about that.
The School of Design was highly critical.
But, I mean, I think that maybe it's a factor of time having gone by, but almost everybody I speak to in this community adores that building and has great respect for it. And there's a certain timelessness to it from the outside and the inside. So what a great starting point, which I think is what you guys did. What was built? A lot of, I hope it's okay to just speak freely, but a lot of uninspiring
we only have 5 listeners, so Maybe they won't call and criticize you.
Yeah, it's such a missed opportunity. And you, as an architect, you know, and I know many architects and landscape architects and planners and just citizens in Raleigh that know that site and know that area, and maybe even in their daily jobs visit it for whatever reason. And nobody is inspired in being there at all. And it's a real shame. It's a shame when you live in a city that has so much potential, and those buildings are so important. They stand for so much. They are public buildings, and that when you try to, I have to go to a state construction interview, which building is it again? And you say, it's the 4-story, 5-story brown one along whatever, Wilmington. Like, well, which one? You know, there are
Which
a couple.
brown
Well,
one?
is it the ugly one or the uglier one? And it's like, we're never going to get there, you know? And what a shame that's one of the opportunities that architecture has, and landscape architecture and planning, is to create landmarks that are more or less natural in terms of wayfinding, and they're welcoming and all of these things. So it's a real shame. I will say that the green mall between the Legislative Building and the Archdale Building is utilized in very interesting ways. Of course, there are protests there and things like that. But early in the morning, I sometimes will run laps in that area, and there are pretty intense CrossFit groups that meet. I know there's kickball that happens there after hours.
My kids played soccer there. On the weekends.
People have learned to make the most of it, but there are limitations. You certainly couldn't do that during the day, during working hours, because I think people tried to at one time, rumor has it, tried to put on some sort of recreational activities during the day, but it was seen as a distraction for all the people working in those buildings, looking down and seeing people have fun. And
yes, my gosh, we can't let people see baseball in progress.
No. Too much of a distraction. So, I mean, in summary, I personally think what is there is unfortunate. And then I confess I did not know about this plan from 1965 until the last several months. And it was very exciting and interesting to read, of course, but also just devastating that it didn't happen.
Did Dan Moore just not have taste?
No, I think it just wasn't on his radar.
Or vision or anything?
It just wasn't on his radar at all. The legislature didn't like the legislative building either. I mean, they liked it once they moved in.
Yeah.
But they didn't like that it was done by an out-of-state architect, Edward Durrell Stone.
Oh.
They didn't like the fact that it was very expensive, and they called it the Taj Mahal for a long time. So this idea of these expensive architects coming in and building all this expensive stuff was very out of favor. And that contributed to the plan being abandoned and just done piecemeal, really, over the next 40 years. The underground parking that Lewis talked about did get done in part. It was there for 20, 25 years underneath the green area. But when 9/11 came along, they closed that all off to the public. So that cut off a real great access point to that area. You can't park down there anymore unless you're a state employee.
Tells you how long it's been since my kids played soccer.
Yeah.
It was in the 90s.
Yeah. Erin, the AIA North Carolina headquarters, which opened up in 2011, is right across the street from the Archdale Building and this whole site. Tell us about the AIA headquarters, which you helped design, I understand.
Right. Yes, I was fortunate enough to work with Frank Harmon for a number of years after graduating school in Kentucky and moving here. He's the reason I moved here. And one of the last projects I had the opportunity to work on was the AIA headquarters building. And it's funny because I had already lived in Raleigh, which was a lot sleepier when I first moved here in 2002 than it was when the AIA building was in design, but still not incredibly vibrant, especially not on that end of downtown, that north end of downtown. So I would walk and drive and ride my bike by that small lot that it now sits on and think, because it's basically a residual piece of land that was created by roads taking a different route. And I mean, I would try to envision what could possibly ever be on that site. And all I could ever think of was a park, but then it was relatively inaccessible because of all the thoroughfares that were surrounding it. So what an opportunity that they embraced actually trying to put a building there. So yes, there's a building that's pushed all the way up to the street, to Peace Street. It's a very close neighbor to Peace College, even though architecturally speaking, the language of those two buildings and those two, the campus and the AIA building, could not be more different.
Like Swahili and French.
Yeah. Yeah, so it remains to this day, given the development that's happened around it. Some of your standard generica apartment buildings that have been built now to the south of the building, and then a pretty traditional church building that's immediately neighbor to it. None of these things match architecturally, which I actually don't have a problem with. I think it's a pretty wonderful thing. But because the design of the AIA building was so out there and so different, maybe in the same way that this plan was so out there and so different. However, this one was built, which was so wonderful. I know the scales were way off. This is only a 12,000 square foot building on a tiny lot. But it was interesting, especially the first couple of years of it coming out of the ground and then existing and people experiencing it, either walking in or driving by or whatever. Most of the people hated the building, I would say. And it was voted, I think, this in 1 year, both the most beautiful and the most ugly building.
Yes, double honors.
Double honors. And I remember I learned so much from Frank and his attitude towards that, which was because you would get news or hear certain people's opinions one day and certain people's the next, and they would vary so differently. And Frank would say, well, so you'd be on this high, like, oh, they love it, they're coming around, and oh my gosh, they hate it, and they didn't hold back at all when they saw me in the grocery store. But he ultimately said, good architecture gets people talking. And I think that is the truth. That is what it has the opportunity to put you on the map. And I think that the pursuit of this sort of design for the AIA headquarters was definitely did that. And again, just keep going back to this 1965 plan. What a shame, because we could have been put on the map. I mean, that was an incredibly forward-thinking, bold move. Such a loss.
Lewis, when you came to the U.S. and worked at Harvard and worked here, of course, were master plans something that people tended to follow a lot more? Because when I hear master plan being bandied about in the triangle the last 15, 20 years, they get done, but then I don't really see the things happen. Was it different between now and then?
I think it's between the private field and the institutional field.
Okay.
There are a lot of master plans that do get done, or maybe I should rephrase that, used to get done. For instance, Palmetto Dunes on the Hilton Head,
all right,
all the Charlie Fraser master plans, they were like 2,000 acres and got built out because they were profitable or they went bankrupt, one or the other, and they had the golf courses. Two here are Carolina Trace in Sanford.
Yes.
That is, I'm guessing, probably 1,600 acres. Carolina Lakes further down the road. And then there's Goodnight's.
Jim Goodnight?
Sass, yes.
Prescott, is it?
Preston.
Well, I mean, I don't know how many acres, many hundreds of acres. I think you can find many master plans in the private field. Very, very few in the government field.
Well, there's one I wanted to ask you about because it's one of my favorite. When I was in high school, we had some sort of math quiz day, and they shoved us on a bus, and we went to some godforsaken town down near Laurinburg and onto this magical campus called St. Andrews. And that had your mark all over it. Tell us about that project, and that seemed to be a master plan that came true.
That's another one of those lucky things. I used to do quite a lot of work as consulting for Goody Odell.
Okay.
And he called me one day and said, come on, give us a hand with this college. When I got there, I was absolutely horrified. architects either understand or they don't understand. They either understand about people, and people have 5 senses, and they know the world because they hear it, and they smell it, and they taste it, and the tactility of walking on the ground. And the best designers are superbly developed in the 5 senses. Here was a wonderful project that the Presbyterians wanted to build a whole college for themselves. Goldie had 4 or 5 buildings scattered and then some in a straight line down the road. And I said, my God, I mean, of all the opportunities to build a college. So he and I got on well, and he said, well, take a look at it. And I wandered over on the site, and there was some, I can't remember, but probably 5 or 6, even more acres than that they owned, that the Presbyterian people owned, and it had a little lake on it. So, of course, obvious what we should do. We should raise the dam, make a big dam in the middle, and build a college around the lake. Now, in those days, men and women could only talk to each other. I mean, they could not associate any closer.
Yes.
So the women were on one side of the lake.
Because it might lead to dancing or something.
So there was a woman's set of dormitories we had to deal with, and then a male set of dormitories, and they all came together in the student union. And then on the plan we came up with, then you cross the causeway to all the academic on the other side. And it was one of the very first campuses built as a pedestrian campus. All the parking was on the perimeter, and you walked in. And Goldie took a lot of persuasion, but he finally agreed. And he was in working drawing stage at the time. So he scrapped it, and so we got Laurinburg College. Thank you, Goldie. And it's now just gone on the Ancient Monuments Register.
Historic, National Historic? Okay.
It's not quite ancient.
Not quite ancient yet.
I like ancient.
Actually, Joyce, I got another little story. I guess it's really gossip.
Okay.
But,
Tell us some gossip, Lewis.
Well, it's not really gossip, but after we'd finished the master plan, and of course, I didn't have much respect for Governor Moore at that time, but then I got a call from Janelle. And she came.
Janelle, his wife?
Yeah, Janelle Moore.
Okay.
So I went over and we had a glass of sherry, and she said, we've got to do something about this because the governor's mansion is built right in the middle of a block. So everybody walked across it. They cut the corner. And it was just a children's playground. Everybody used it, and the governor lived in the middle. And she said, we've got to stop this. And that was the time, because this was a few years after we'd finished the master plan, yes, when people were getting shot, especially government officials. And Governor Moore used to sit under a canopy on the south side, and there were apartment buildings 3 stories high. So they were worried about him being shot. So there was no privacy whatsoever. So we did a plan for the grounds.
And the wall that's up there now.
And the wall was the result of the plan.
Okay.
And so, having worked on this wonderful plan with the gardens and the lakes and so on, I suddenly built another wall that cut the public off from the governor's house. and in the plan, the governor's house was left completely open.
You can Google the North Carolina Governor's Mansion. Just go on the web and look North Carolina Governor's Mansion, Blunt Street. And you can also Google the St. Andrews campus. The aerial views are really something. You can really get a sense of how you park on the outside and you walk through the campus. One last question for you, Erin. We kind of struck out here with master plans getting accomplished, but I understand that you're working on a new master plan with architects for an area of Raleigh. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I guess you could call it that. Definitely master plan. I like to think of it that way. And actually, Lewis, definitely stay tuned for this. Now that I've gotten to know you, I would like to officially invite you to this. So 50 plus years later, after your work on the North Carolina State Capital Plan, we need you in this that I'm planning right now. So what it is a design charrette that's scheduled for next May. It's actually going to happen on May 19th. That's a Saturday. AIA Triangle, the Activate, which is the public outreach initiative, is basically starting a conversation through this charrette process that asks the question, if Raleigh's Central Prison and the neighboring site, the Governor Moorhead School for the Blind, were to relocate or take a different form, so the prison would have to relocate, and ideally the School for the Blind would become absorbed in this new master plan. It's 81.2 acres, which resides in a prime location in our state. I mean, it's immediately adjacent to Dix Park, to Pullen Park, to Boylan Heights neighborhood, to Centennial Campus, to NC State's main campus. And because it's state-owned property with the various activities on them, it's really difficult for both the city of Raleigh and the state of North Carolina to be the one to ask those questions and to initiate a plan or any sort of visioning that asks that question. So in the spirit of Activate in this public outreach initiative, our group has come together and a bunch of architects are going to be the ones to lead that conversation. So we're having the charrette again on Saturday, May 19th, that starts to envision what would this 81.2 acres look like if we had the opportunity to overlay some sort of program on it, which right now we're working on that program being an Amazon or an Amazon-like headquarters or second headquarters or whatever entity, along with housing, both affordable and market rate, hospitality, other amenities, open space, and to reabsorb the Governor Moorhead School for the Blind. And also the idea is to reuse some of the larger state investment buildings, such as the hospital that is associated with the prison. There's a very important historic structure or more on the state prison site. And then again, reusing that use of the Governor's Moorhead School for the Blind. So this is a very hypothetical. I have to continue to say that. I've been told by both the city and the state. It's a very hypothetical question. But our goal is, again, to start that conversation. We know this 81.2 acres is going to become something amazing and important in our city. And so if we start it now and then design a way to keep that conversation going after May, that is our goal. And we feel like we would have achieved something. And all the while, it's really, in my opinion, what architects should be doing. And it's not going to be a charrette about just architects. We're inviting landscape architects, developers, planners, economists even, real estate folks to be around that table to have that conversation so that it really gets some good teeth to it and we can take it somewhere. So please, Lewis, you're more than welcome to come, and I hope you will.
I would suggest, Erin, that you don't forget that investment is also a part of design. And to put land in reserve is sometimes the greatest thing we can do.
Yeah, that's
sometimes really on a master plan. If it's, say, on the ocean, we'll take a whole strip of the ocean and reserve it. It's like putting money in the bank. Down the road, you say, thank God we did this.
Right.
So putting land in reserve is a wonderful thing to do.
Yes, absolutely.
If you can do it
yes.
and stop these people always wanting to build.
Right. Well, and you have to remember that the Dix Park, which will be largely open space and park, I think, we're not sure. The master plan is just now beginning for that. I do think it's 306 acres. And so when you have that 81.2 acres immediately across the street, that is a huge potential to make massive, important connections. How do those two things speak to one another? I mean, I think it won't end up being just green space. I think Dix Park right across the way is going to absorb a lot of that use.
No, Dix is a very strong element in that consideration, obviously.
So as our design charrette begins right here in the studio, you can tune in again.
We can't help it. Where's the trace paper?
Right. You can tune in again on May 19th. If you want information about the Activate program, you can go to aianc.org. You can also see Erin's work at, what's your website?
www.insitustudio.us.
That's INSITUSTUDIO.US. Right?
That's right. You got it.
Well, thank you both for being on the show today. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. This was really fun. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to do a little thing here.
Oh, is this where you sing?
Yes. Modernism's coming to town. Modernism's coming to town. Modernism's coming to town. Sorry, I got carried away. Thanks for listening. US Modernist Radio is underwritten by Sarah Sonk, your real estate agent for Modernist Houses. 919-601-7339. Okay, take us out, Tom.
If you're curious, you can see the 1965 State Capitol Master Plan mentioned today at www.ncmodernist.org/1965plan.pdf. You can also visit usmodernist.org for more information about everything we talked about today. US Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Cindy Stratton researches guests in her pajamas from her secret underground bunker.
Yes, very secret.
U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of North Carolina Modernist Houses, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. U.S. Modernist Radio is not for everyone. Do not listen to U.S. Modernist Radio if you are allergic to great design. Side effects can include euphoria, uncontrollable attraction to terrazzo floors, and travel to Europe. Social interactions may be affected when you start to work the words Mies, Gropius, and Brewer into your party conversation. And finally, do not renovate your modernist house into an Italianate villa. Yes, we're talking to you, Priscilla Presley. George and Frank and I'll be back in 2 weeks with another all-shook-up edition of U.S. Modernist Radio. Merry Christmas, everybody.
Merry Christmas.